The Sterling estate was a sprawling monument to old money and cold hearts. Every surface gleamed with polished Italian marble, and the air always carried the faint, oppressive scent of expensive lilies and floor wax. But for Liam, this mansion wasn't a home. It was a golden cage where he wore the invisible uniform of a servant. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Liam was on his hands and knees in the grand foyer, scrubbing a stubborn red wine stain from an antique Persian rug. The stain was, as always, courtesy of his older brother, Richard. Footsteps echoed down the sweeping grand staircase. Slow, deliberate, and commanding. It was their mother, Eleanor. She wore a perfectly tailored Chanel suit, her sharp eyes scanning the foyer like a general inspecting a battlefield. They landed on Liam, but they didn't soften. They didn't see a son. They saw a nuisance. Make sure that is completely spotless before the board members arrive for lunch, Eleanor snapped, her voice like cracking ice. And change out of those hideous clothes. You look like the groundskeeper. Actually, I think the groundskeeper dresses better. Before Liam could formulate a response, Richard sauntered down the stairs, carelessly adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He stepped deliberately close to Liam's bucket of soapy water, kicking it just enough to splash dirty gray water onto the freshly cleaned marble floor. Careful, little brother, Richard sneered, admiring his own reflection in the gilded hallway mirror. You missed a spot. Though, I suppose cleaning up my messes is the only thing you've ever been truly good at. Don't worry, when I take over the company next month, I'll make sure you get a promotion. Maybe head janitor. Eleanor chuckled softly, stepping forward to fix Richard's perfectly straight tie. Now, Richard, don't tease him. Someone has to do the heavy lifting while you run the empire. Your grandfather's condition is worsening rapidly. We need to be prepared for the transition. Liam gripped the wooden handle of the scrubbing brush so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He didn't say a word. He had learned long ago that defending himself in this house only invited more cruelty. He simply lowered his head, breathing in the smell of bleach and wet wool, and began wiping up the splashed water, burying his anger deep inside his chest. Later that evening, the heavy oak doors of the master's suite creaked open. The extravagant scent of lilies was instantly replaced by the sterile, sharp odor of medical antiseptics and rubbing alcohol. In the center of the vast, dimly lit room lay Arthur Sterling, the ruthless billionaire who had built the family empire from nothing but dirt and ambition. Arthur was a shadow of his former self, hooked up to a symphony of beeping monitors and plastic tubes. But when his eyes found Liam standing awkwardly in the doorway, they still held that terrifying, piercing intelligence that had made Wall Street tremble. Liam, the old man rasped, his voice barely more than a dry, rattling whisper. Close the door. Lock it. Liam did as he was told, the heavy brass lock clicking into place. He approached the bed with careful, silent steps. Grandfather. How are you feeling? Like a man who is about to die, Arthur replied bluntly, coughing violently into a silk handkerchief. Sit down. We don't have much time, and I don't want Eleanor's spies hearing a word of this. Arthur's trembling, liver-spotted hand reached under his thick down pillow. He fumbled for a painful moment before pulling out a small, surprisingly heavy object wrapped in a piece of faded black velvet. He pressed it into Liam's palm. Liam slowly unwrapped the fabric. It was a key. But it wasn't a sleek, modern electronic key card or a polished brass key to a bank vault. It was heavy, made of dark, cold iron, and covered in patches of rough, orange rust. It looked like it belonged to an abandoned medieval dungeon, not a billionaire's modern estate. I know how they treat you, Arthur whispered, his grip suddenly tightening around Liam's wrist with shocking strength. I see it all. I see Richard's blind arrogance. I see your mother's poisonous greed. They think they have already won the game. Grandfather, you need to rest. Listen to me. Arthur interrupted, his eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce light. Richard is a fool playing dress-up in my suits. He will destroy everything I built. When I am gone, they will cast you out. They will humiliate you in front of the entire world. Let them. Liam stared at the rusty key, completely bewildered. The iron was cold against his skin. I don't understand. What is this for? What is it open? Arthur leaned back against the pillows, his chest heaving with the immense effort of speaking. A faint, knowing smile touched his pale, dry lips. It is the only thing that matters, Liam. Do not lose it. Do not tell them about it. When the time is right, when Richard has shown the world exactly who he is, the lock will reveal itself. And then, you will show them what a true sterling looks like. Before Liam could ask another question, the heavy brass doorknob rattled violently. Eleanor's sharp, panicked voice pierced through the thick oak door. Father? Who locked this door? Liam, are you in there bothering him? Arthur closed his eyes, his breathing slowing down, a look of final peace settling over his weary features. Hide it, he breathed out into the quiet room. Liam slipped the heavy iron key deep into his coat pocket just as the door burst open. He didn't know what the key opened, but as his mother stormed in, glaring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred, Liam realized his grandfather hadn't just given him a trinket. He had given him a weapon. 1 week later, the Sterling mansion was shrouded in a silence that felt more like a celebration than mourning. Arthur Sterling had been buried in a private ceremony, and now, the family gathered in the grand library for the reading of the will. The room was suffocating, filled with the smell of old leather-bound books and the predatory anticipation of Eleanor and Richard. Mr. Henderson, the family's longtime attorney, sat behind a massive mahogany desk. He looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. Richard sat in the front row, already leaning back with his feet crossed, acting as if he already owned the air in the room. Eleanor sat beside him, her face a mask of regal indifference. Liam sat in the very back, in a hard wooden chair ignored by everyone. Shall we begin? Mr. Henderson's voice was thin. He cleared his throat and began to read. To my daughter-in-law, Eleanor, I leave the Sterling family estate and a lifetime stipend of $5 million annually, provided she maintains the family's public reputation. Eleanor gave a sharp, satisfied nod. To my eldest grandson, Richard Sterling, Henderson continued, his voice dropping an octave, I leave the entirety of Sterling Global Enterprises, including all subsidiaries, private jets, and the controlling interest in the board of directors. I leave him the responsibility of carrying our name into the next century. Richard let out a sharp, triumphant laugh, slapping his knee. The king has returned. Did you hear that, Liam? The whole empire. Every single brick. Liam felt a cold pit in his stomach. He looked at Henderson, waiting. And finally, Henderson whispered, to my grandson, Liam, for reasons known only to me, I leave the contents of the black velvet wrap he currently possesses. May he find the value in it that his brother never could. This is my final and irrevocable decree. The room went deathly silent. Richard turned in his chair, his face contorted in a sneer. A velvet wrap? You mean that piece of rusted junk he's been carrying around? That's it? Grandfather left the empire to me and gave you trash. It appears so, Eleanor said, standing up, her eyes gleaming with a cruel light. A fitting inheritance for a boy who spent his life scrubbing floors. A piece of garbage for a piece of garbage. Liam gripped the rusty key in his pocket. It felt incredibly heavy, almost vibrating against his leg. He looked at Mr. Henderson, but the lawyer wouldn't meet his eyes. Henderson looked like a man who had just committed a crime, his face ghost-white as he gathered his papers with frantic speed. The humiliation didn't end in the library. Within 30 minutes of the will reading, 2 large security guards in black suits stood at the entrance of the grand foyer. What is the meaning of this? Liam asked, staring at his mother. Eleanor was standing on the grand staircase, looking down at him like he was an insect. The meaning is simple, Liam. This house belongs to me now. The company belongs to Richard. You are no longer a Sterling. You are a liability. A reminder of a past we are eager to forget. Richard walked up behind the guards, holding a small, beat-up canvas duffel bag. He tossed it at Liam's feet. I took the liberty of packing for you. I left out the designer clothes. Since you didn't pay for them, they stay here. I think there are a few pairs of old jeans and some t-shirts in there. Consider it a parting gift. You can't do this, Liam said, his voice remarkably steady despite the roar of blood in his ears. I grew up here. "This is my home." "Not anymore," Richard barked. "Security, escort this stranger off the property. If he sets foot on Sterling land again, have him arrested for trespassing." The guards didn't hesitate. They grabbed Liam by the arms, their grip bruising and forceful. They dragged him across the marble floor he had spent years cleaning, past the portraits of his ancestors who seemed to look down at him with shame. They marched him down the long, winding driveway and threw him out of the massive iron gates. The heavy gates slammed shut with a final, metallic clang that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Liam stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind biting through his thin shirt. He looked down at the pathetic duffel bag at his feet. Across the street, the world moved on, cars driving by, people living their lives, completely unaware that a billionaire's grandson had just been turned into a ghost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusty key. It looked even more pathetic in the gray afternoon light. "Value that your brother never could," he whispered, reciting his grandfather's words. He didn't have a car. He didn't have a phone. He had exactly $42 in his wallet and a key to a door he couldn't find. Richard and Eleanor thought they had destroyed him. They thought they had won. But as Liam looked back at the sprawling mansion through the iron bars, he felt something cold and hard crystallize in his heart. He wasn't just going to survive. He was going to wait. And when the lock finally revealed itself, he would burn their empire to the ground. #Act 3, the Year of Ruin and the Swiss. Discovery: a montage of passing time. 1 year. 12 months of brutal consequence. While Liam worked night shifts in a greasy diner in Brooklyn, meticulously saving every penny and poring over international banking laws in the dim light of a public library, the Sterling empire was bleeding out. Richard Sterling's tenure as CEO was a spectacular disaster of ego and incompetence. He didn't just fail to run the company, he treated it like an unlimited ATM for his vanity. News headlines flashed in rapid succession on the diner's small TV screen. Sterling global stocks plummet 30% amidst scandal. CEO Richard Sterling throws $5 million yacht party as thousands laid off. Sterling Air invests billions in failed crypto venture. Inside the mansion, the marble floors were no longer perfectly clean. Eleanor paced the grand foyer, her Chanel suits looking slightly rumpled. The house staff had been reduced to almost nothing. The bank notices were piling up on the silver tray in the hallway, thick, red letters demanding payment. Richard had mortgaged everything. The private jets were repossessed. The luxury cars were sold off quietly in the dead of night. "We need more time." Richard screamed into his phone during a frantic call with a board member, his face flushed and sweating, a glass of expensive whiskey trembling in his hand. "Just another loan. I promise I can turn this around." The board member hung up on him. The Sterling name, once a symbol of unbreakable power, was now toxic. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet, snowy streets of Zurich, Switzerland, Liam stood outside the imposing stone facade of Banque Privée Helvetica. He wore a cheap winter coat, but his posture was straight, his eyes focused. He had spent months tracking down the origin of the strange metallurgical composition of his grandfather's rusty key. It wasn't standard iron, it was a rare, vintage alloy used exclusively by high-security European vaults in the 1970s. He walked into the bank. The air inside was completely still, smelling of old money and absolute discretion. An elegant banker with silver hair approached him. "May I help you, sir?" Liam didn't speak. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out the heavy, rusty key, and placed it on the polished mahogany counter. The banker's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the ancient design. "Follow me, sir," the banker said, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper. They descended deep underground, passing through a series of massive steel doors and retinal scanners. The air grew colder, heavier. Finally, they reached a long, silent corridor lined with thousands of small, identical metal boxes. The banker stopped at box 1409. He inserted a master electronic key into the upper slot, then gestured for Liam to use his key on the lower, antique lock. Liam's hand shook slightly as he inserted the rusty iron key. It fit perfectly. He turned it. A heavy, satisfying click echoed in the silent vault. Liam pulled the metal box out and placed it on a small table. He lifted the lid. Inside, there was no gold, no diamonds, no stacks of cash. There was only a single, thick manila envelope sealed with red wax bearing the Sterling family crest. And on top of the envelope, a small, handwritten note in his grandfather's shaky script. Asterisk, Liam, if you are reading this, Richard has failed and the vultures are circling. It is time. Asterisk, Liam broke the wax seal. He pulled out a stack of documents. The first page took his breath away. It was a legal document, dated 3 days before Arthur's death. It was the true, irrevocable last will and testament of Arthur Sterling. As Liam read the dense legal jargon, his heart hammered against his ribs. The will Mr. Henderson had read a year ago was a decoy, a carefully constructed test designed by his grandfather. Arthur had known Richard would bankrupt the company. He had let him take the wheel just to prove to the board how incompetent he was. The real will was ironclad. Arthur had secretly transferred a hidden block of founders' shares into a blind trust, making up exactly 51% of Sterling Global Enterprises. And the sole beneficiary of that trust, the absolute controlling shareholder of the entire multi-billion-dollar empire, was Liam Sterling. But there was a catch. The documents stipulated that Liam could only claim his shares when the company's stock price fell. Below a specific threshold, a threshold Richard had disastrously crossed just 2 days ago. Liam stared at the papers. The rusty key hadn't just opened a box. It had unlocked an empire. He wasn't the invisible son anymore. He was the owner. He carefully placed the documents back into the envelope, a cold, predatory smile spreading across his face. It was time to go home. The penthouse boardroom of Sterling Global in Manhattan was usually a place of terrifying power. Today, it felt like a funeral home. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a heavy thunderstorm battered the glass, matching the grim, suffocating reality inside. Richard sat at the head of the massive obsidian table. He looked 10 years older than his actual age. His expensive designer suit hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His tie was carelessly unknotted, and a thin sheen of cold, nervous sweat coated his forehead. Next to him sat Eleanor. Her posture was rigidly straight, but the deep, haggard lines around her mouth and the frantic, darting movements of her eyes betrayed her absolute panic. Across the table sat 3 men in charcoal gray suits. They represented Apex Holdings, a ruthless private equity firm known in the financial world as the Vultures. They bought dying companies, stripped them for parts, and left nothing but ashes. The terms are non-negotiable, Richard, the lead investor, a man named Vance, said with a predatory, mocking smile. He slid a thick stack of legal documents across the dark, polished table. We take 80% of the company. We liquidate all subsidiaries. We also take the deeds to all private properties, including the Sterling estate in Connecticut. In exchange, we clear your massive debts and keep you out of federal prison for the highly illegal creative accounting you've been doing this past year. Eleanor flinched as if she had been physically struck. The estate? Our home? You cannot take the house. Generations of Sterlings have lived there. It is a historical landmark. Vance didn't even look at her. He kept his cold eyes on Richard. You don't have a home anymore, Mrs. Sterling. You have liabilities. Sign the papers, Richard. Or we walk out that door. Right now, and the feds will be arresting you by Friday morning. Richard's hand trembled violently as he reached for the gold Montblanc pen lying on the table. It was his grandfather's pen. The irony made him sick to his stomach. He was about to sign away his grandfather's legacy, his ancestral home, his entire identity, just to save his own skin. He uncapped the pen, the gold nib hovering millimeters above the signature line. Do it, Richard, Eleanor hissed, her voice filled with venom, desperation, and utter defeat. Just sign the damn thing, so we can salvage whatever miserable scraps are left. Richard closed his eyes tightly and pressed the gold pen to the paper. A small dot of black ink bled into the thick parchment. Then a loud, violent crash echoed from the reception area outside. The heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom shuttered. Muffled shouts and the sound of a scuffle could be heard. Vance frowned, looking over his shoulder. What is going on out there? Suddenly, the doors swung open with such tremendous force that one of them slammed against the wall, cracking the plaster and shattering the tense tranquility of the room. Two massive corporate security guards stumbled backward into the boardroom, looking completely disoriented and terrified. Stepping over the threshold, moving with a calm, terrifying grace, was a man they barely recognized. It was Liam. He wasn't wearing the faded t-shirts or the servants' rags they remembered. He was dressed in a razor-sharp, bespoke midnight blue suit that seemed to absorb the light in the room. His hair was perfectly styled, his posture impeccable, radiating an aura of absolute, crushing authority. In that moment, he looked exactly like Arthur Sterling in his prime. In his right hand, he held a thick manila envelope sealed with dark red wax. Richard dropped the pen, his jaw slackening. He blinked rapidly, thinking the extreme stress was finally making him hallucinate. Liam? What the hell are you doing here? You're banned from this building. Eleanor stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her face flushed with sudden, irrational rage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at him. How dare you show your face here? Security! I told you to keep this trash out of the building. Arrest him and throw him in the street. The security guards hesitated, moving forward tentatively. Liam didn't even look at them. He simply raised one hand, a subtle, commanding gesture that froze the guards in their tracks. He kept his eyes locked dead on Richard, walking slowly and deliberately toward the head of the obsidian table. I wouldn't sign that if I were you, Richard, Liam said. His voice was smooth, deep, and completely devoid of fear. It echoed in the silent boardroom like a judge delivering an execution sentence. Vance sneered, annoyed by the interruption. Who is this kid? Richard, deal with your pathetic family drama on your own time. We are closing a multi-billion-dollar deal here. Liam finally stopped at the edge of the table. He looked down at the Apex Holdings investors, a chilling, triumphant smile playing on his lips. There is no deal, Liam stated softly. And if you want to keep your firm from facing a massive, career-ending federal lawsuit, I suggest you pack up those illegal contracts and leave my boardroom. He tossed the heavy manila envelope onto the center of the table. It landed with a loud, definitive thud, right on top of the buyout documents. The red wax seal of the Sterling family gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. The trap was set. The invisible son had finally returned to claim his throne. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the boardroom was the heavy rain violently lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Everyone stared at the manila envelope sitting on the dark obsidian table, its thick red wax seal looking like a drop of fresh blood. Then, Richard started to laugh. It began as a low chuckle and quickly escalated into a loud, grating, hysterical roar. He leaned back in his leather chair, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. Oh, this is priceless. Truly priceless. Let me guess, Liam? You found some old coupons? Or maybe a drawing you made for grandfather when you were 5. Eleanor scoffed, a venomous smile twisting her sharp features. She looked Liam up and down, her eyes full of utter disdain. Where did you steal that suit, Liam? Or did you rent it using the spare change you begged for on the subway? You are pathetic. Crashing a private corporate buyout because you're desperate for a handout. Liam stood perfectly still. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just watched them with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing insects in a jar. Richard turned to Vance, the lead investor from Apex Holdings, waving his hand dismissively. I apologize for the theatrical interruption, gentlemen. This is my estranged younger brother. He has a history of severe mental instability. He used to scrub the floors at my estate before I finally had to evict him for his own good. Vance looked thoroughly unamused. He checked his heavy gold Rolex. We are wasting time, Richard. Get this lunatic out of here so we can finalize the transfer. Immediately, Richard snapped. He glared at the two security guards who were still hovering nervously near the shattered doors. What are you idiots waiting for? I pay you to protect this building. Grab him by the collar, drag him to the freight elevator, and throw him into the alley. If he resists, break his legs. The guards stepped forward, their massive hands reaching out to grab Liam's shoulders. I wouldn't touch me, Liam said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a chilling, magnetic authority that made the guards freeze instantly. He didn't look at his family or the guards. He looked directly at the sharp-eyed woman sitting next to Vance, Apex Holdings' lead corporate counsel. Counselor, Liam said, gesturing gracefully toward the manila envelope on the table. Before your client signs a contract that will constitute massive, multi-billion-dollar corporate fraud, I highly recommend you open that envelope. Unless, of course, your firm enjoys dealing with the SEC and federal prison time. Vance's lawyer narrowed her eyes. In the ruthless world of corporate acquisitions, you never ignored a direct threat of federal fraud. She looked at Vance, who gave her a short, tense nod. Don't touch that garbage, Richard yelled, slamming his hands on the table. I am the CEO. I order you to ignore him. The lawyer ignored Richard completely. She reached across the polished table, her manicured fingers grasping the heavy envelope. She picked up a silver letter opener, slipped it under the flap, and cleanly broke the red wax seal. The room held its collective breath. The rustle of thick, vintage parchment seemed deafening in the quiet room. She pulled out the stack of documents, adjusted her designer glasses, and began to read. At first, her expression was neutral. 10 seconds later, her brow furrowed. 20 seconds in, all the color violently drained from her face. Her hands, previously rock-steady, began to tremble so violently that the papers rattled against the table. What is it? Vance demanded, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the room's atmosphere. Is it a lawsuit? The lawyer slowly lowered the documents. She looked at Richard, not with annoyance, but with profound, absolute horror. Then she looked at Liam, her eyes wide with newfound reverence. Mr. Vance, she whispered, her voice shaking. We need to stop the signing. Immediately. What are you talking about? Richard screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. The deal is done. I am the sole owner of this company. My grandfather left it all to me. He left you a title, Richard, Liam finally spoke, his voice slicing through the panic like a scalpel. He left you a title, an office, and enough rope to hang yourself. The lawyer swallowed hard, placing the documents flat on the table for Vance to see. These are authenticated, original trust documents drafted by Arthur Sterling before his death. They bear his watermark, his signature, and the seals of 3 independent Swiss magistrates. What do they say? Vance demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. They state, the lawyer continued, wiping sweat from her forehead, that Arthur Sterling secretly transferred exactly 51% of all voting shares, the founder's shares, into a blind trust. Richard Sterling only ever inherited 49%. Eleanor gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. That's impossible. The trust would have been public. Not this one, Liam said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the head of the table. The trust was locked. It had a trigger clause. It would only release the shares if the company's valuation dropped below $3 billion. A failsafe against a catastrophic failure of leadership. Liam stopped right next to Richard's chair. He looked down at his older brother, whose face had gone completely slack with terror. You hit that threshold 2 days ago, Richard, Liam whispered, leaning in close. You bankrupted the company just like he knew you would. And as of this morning, the trust was legally dissolved. The lawyer looked at Vance and delivered the final, fatal blow. Richard has no legal authority to sell this company, Mr. Vance. The man standing next to him is the absolute majority shareholder. He owns Sterling Global. The pen slipped from Richard's numb fingers, clattering loudly against the obsidian table. The empire hadn't just crumbled, it had completely changed hands, right in front of his eyes. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the sound of an empire changing hands in the blink of an eye. Vance, the ruthless lead investor from Apex Holdings, was the first to move. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He simply stood up, his face a mask of cold, professional fury. He grabbed the illegal buyout contracts, shoved them brutally into his leather briefcase, and snapped it shut. The loud click echoed like a gunshot. You lied to us, Richard, Vance said, his voice dripping with venom. You almost made us accomplices to federal fraud. If you ever contact my firm again, I will personally see to it that you are buried in litigation until the day you die. Vance turned to Liam, offering a curt, respectful nod, the universal corporate sign of recognizing a true apex predator. Mr. Sterling, it seems your grandfather left the company in capable hands after all. Good day. As the investors stormed out of the shattered glass doors, Richard finally snapped. The reality of his absolute ruin crashed down on him. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. No, you can't do this. Richard screamed, lunging across the obsidian table toward Liam, his hands clawing wildly at the air. I am the CEO. I am the golden child. Grandfather loved me. Liam didn't even flinch. He didn't have to. The two massive security guards, who just minutes ago were ready to throw Liam into the alley, now stepped forward with brutal efficiency. They grabbed Richard by the arms, slamming him back down into his leather chair with enough force to knock the wind out of him. They knew exactly who signed their paychecks now. Liam slowly walked around the table and stood behind the high-backed CEO chair. He looked down at his older brother. Richard was hyperventilating, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled. He looked small, pathetic. Grandfather didn't love you, Richard, Liam said, his voice dangerously calm. He tolerated you. And then, he used you as a stress test to see how much damage a fool could do to a billion-dollar machine. Liam reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black titanium keycard, the master access pass to the entire building, which had been inside the Swiss vault envelope. He tapped it on the table. As the majority shareholder and the new acting chairman of the board, Liam announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality, I am officially terminating your employment at Sterling Global Enterprises. Effective immediately. You are stripped of your title, your corporate accounts are frozen, and your company car has already been towed from the executive garage. Liam, please. Richard sobbed, the arrogance completely wiped from his face. I have nothing. The debts, the creditors, they'll kill me. Then I suggest you learn how to scrub floors, Liam replied coldly. I hear it builds character. Suddenly, Eleanor rushed forward. The venomous, aristocratic matriarch was gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate woman trying to play a card she didn't possess. She reached out, her trembling hands attempting to grasp Liam's arm. She forced a tearful, wobbly smile. Liam, my sweet boy. Oh, I knew it. I always knew Arthur saw your potential. We were just testing you, darling. Preparing you for the real world. You must know I love you. We are family. Liam looked at the hand resting on his sleeve. The sheer audacity of her lie was sickening. He felt a wave of absolute disgust wash over him. He calmly, deliberately brushed her hand off his suit as if she were a carrier of some foul disease. Do not ever call me your boy, Liam whispered, his eyes narrowing into dark, unforgiving slits. You lost the right to call me family the day you threw me out into the street with nothing but a canvas duffel bag. Eleanor stumbled backward, the fake smile collapsing, her face turning a sickly shade of gray. Speaking of bags, Liam continued, turning to the head of security. Marcus, escort my former brother and his mother out of the building. Do not let them pack a single box from this office. Then I want you to send a team to the Sterling estate in Connecticut. Eleanor gasped, clutching her chest. No. Liam, you cannot take my home. It was never your home, Eleanor. It was grandfather's. And now it is mine, Liam stated, turning his back on them to look out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The heavy rain was beginning to clear, pale sunlight breaking through the dark clouds over Manhattan. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises. Take only the clothes on your backs. If you are still on the property when the hour is up, Marcus will have you arrested for trespassing. You monster! Eleanor shrieked, her voice cracking in hysterics as the guards grabbed her by the arms. You vindictive, ungrateful monster. No, Liam said softly, looking at his own faint reflection in the glass. Just a Sterling. He listened to the sounds of Richard and Eleanor crying and screaming as they were forcefully dragged down the hallway, the heavy boardroom doors slowly closing behind them. The noise faded into the distance until there was nothing left but absolute, peaceful silence. Liam stood alone in the center of power. He reached into his pocket one last time, pulling out the heavy, rusted iron key. He held it up to the light, smiling. The invisible sun had finally stepped out of the shadows, and the empire was his.